Hello and welcome. You stand at the edge of an impossible history where the very act of wielding power consumed an entire world. This is not a tale of noble sacrifice or heroic warfare. This is the story of how magic itself became a weapon of such devastating hunger that it devoured oceans, murdered entire species, and transformed a paradise into an endless graveyard of sand and bone. The Cleansing Wars were not fought for territory or treasure. They were fought for extinction itself, a systematic annihilation that would leave the world of Athas forever broken, forever dying, forever scarred by the ambitions of one immortal and the champions who served him. Before the desert, before the endless dunes of ash and the choking sea of silt, before the tyrannical Sorcerer-Kings ruled their desperate city-states with iron and magic, there was water, abundant, life-giving water that covered almost the entire world. You would not recognize ancient Athas if you saw it, so complete is its transformation. The planet you know as the Burning Lands, the world beneath the crimson sun, once thrived with such vitality that its earliest inhabitants never knew hunger, never knew want, never imagined that their paradise could become a tomb. This was the Blue Age, the first age of Athas, and it belonged entirely to the halflings. Picture a world ocean, vast and endless, stretching from horizon to horizon under a gentle blue sun. The halflings did not build cities of stone or towers of metal. They had no need for such crude constructions. They were masters of life-shaping, an art so profound that it makes modern magic seem like the fumbling of children. With life-shaping, the halflings could mold living tissue itself, creating creatures and structures from the raw material of nature. Their cities grew from the ocean floor, living edifices of coral and shell that breathed and pulsed with their own metabolism. Their tools were grown, not forged. Their vessels were bred, not built. The halflings lived in perfect harmony with their aquatic world. They cultivated vast gardens of kelp and bred fish that served as transportation, as food, as companions. They shaped new forms of life to fulfill every need. And they did so without taking, without destroying, without consuming anything beyond what the ocean freely gave. For thousands upon thousands of years, this was the natural order of Athas. Life, abundant and diverse, filling every corner of the world ocean under the careful stewardship of halfling life shapers. But even paradise contains the seeds of catastrophe. The halflings, in their mastery, grew ambitious. Some among them began to experiment with life-shaping in ways that pushed the boundaries of their art. In one of their great cities, a place called Tyagi, a group of nature masters engineered something new, something they believed would revolutionize their civilization. They attempted to expand the life force of the ocean itself. They believed they had shaped the ultimate organism, one that would increase the vitality of the seas and benefit all halfling civilization. They were catastrophically wrong. The organism they created became known as the brown tide, and it was nothing less than the end of their world. The brown tide was a form of intelligent algae, but to call it merely algae fails to capture the horror of what it became. It spread across the ocean with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. It fed on all other life forms, breaking them down and incorporating their biomass into itself. It grew exponentially, doubling and redoubling its mass with each passing day. The ocean began to change color as the brown tide spread, turning from clear blue to murky brown, then to a thick, choking mass that blocked out sunlight and killed everything it touched. The halflings tried to stop it. They threw all their knowledge of life shaping against the brown tide, creating predators to eat it, diseases to kill it, barriers to contain it. Nothing worked. The brown tide had been shaped too well. Or perhaps the nature masters had made some fundamental error in its creation that rendered it unstoppable. It adapted to every countermeasure, evolved past every defense. It was the perfect organism in the worst possible way, a creation that existed only to grow and consume. City after city fell silent as the brown tide engulfed them. Entire populations of halflings died, suffocated in the thick morass of their own creation. The world ocean was dying, and with it, the halfling civilization faced extinction. In their desperation, the greatest nature masters gathered at their most sacred site, a place of tremendous power where the energies of the world itself seemed to concentrate. Here, they would attempt something unprecedented, something dangerous beyond all measure. They would reshape not individual organisms, but the fundamental nature of life itself. They would transform the world to save it, even if that transformation cost them everything they were. They called their final creation the Pristine Tower, and it stands to this day, a monument to both salvation and doom. The Pristine Tower was unlike anything the halflings had created before. It was not merely a structure, but a device, a lens that focused the primal energy of the sun itself. Through the tower, the nature masters enacted the rebirth, a transformation so complete that it would alter the very essence of existence on Athas. The light of the Pristine Tower burned away the brown tide, destroying the plague that had consumed their ocean. But the cost was everything they knew. The rebirth changed the world itself. The sun in the sky shifted from blue to yellow, its energy transformed by the forces the Pristine Tower unleashed. Land rose from beneath the dying ocean, mountains thrust upward, continents formed, valleys and plains emerged where once there had been only water. The brown tide could not survive on land, and as the ocean receded, it died with the Blue Age. The nature masters took the genetic material of the halflings themselves and transformed it, expanded it, diversified it into new forms. From the halflings came new races, taller, stronger, more diverse. Humans, elves, dwarves, and other races emerged from the rebirth. as the halflings sacrificed their own genetic purity to create them. Most halflings had transformed into these new races, losing their ancient knowledge and their life-shaping abilities in the process. Only a handful remained true halflings, and they found themselves diminished, no longer the masters of a world ocean, but small survivors in a vastly changed landscape. The Green Age had begun, and Athas became a world of incredible beauty and diversity. Forests stretched across continents. Rivers carved their way through valleys. Rain fell in abundance, feeding lakes and seas that teemed with new forms of life. The new races spread across this transformed world, building their civilizations, discovering agriculture, art, language, culture. They had no memory of the Blue Age, no knowledge of what had come before. To them, this green and growing world was simply how things had always been. For thousands of years, the Green Age flourished. The Wanderer's Journal places the beginning of the Green Age at approximately 14,000 years before the current era. Great cities rose in the fertile valleys. Kingdoms and empires expanded across the continents. The races learned to work metal, to write, to build monuments that reached toward the sky. Trade routes connected distant lands. Scholars studied the natural world and recorded their findings. Artists created works of stunning beauty. It was an age of growth, of discovery, of seemingly limitless potential. But the pristine tower remained, silent and enigmatic, drawing certain individuals toward it with a pull they could not explain. The tower still held power, tremendous power, the same force that had reshaped the world during the rebirth. It called to those with the sensitivity to hear it, those with the potential to touch the energies it contained. One such individual was a human named Rajaat. He was not yet the warbringer, not yet the architect of genocide. In the Green Age, he was a scholar, obsessed with the pristine tower and the mysteries it held. His body was twisted from birth, a malformed thing that marked him as different from other humans. He stood taller than any man, but his height was grotesque, his limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. This physical deformity led to isolation and rejection throughout his life, which may have contributed to the bitterness that would later define his worldview. He spent years studying the tower, decades attempting to understand its function and purpose. He discovered that it could be used to manipulate energy in ways no one had conceived of before. Through his research, Rajaat uncovered something that would change Athas forever. He discovered magic, not life-shaping, which was the art of the ancient halflings and had been largely lost. Magic was something entirely new, a way to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself through will and words and gestures. Rajaat learned to draw energy from the world around him, to shape it with his mind, to manifest effects that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed them. He could create fire from nothing, move objects without touching them, alter his own body in impossible ways. more importantly, he learned to teach others. Magic, unlike life-shaping, could be learned. It did not require ancient bloodlines or genetic predisposition. Any individual with sufficient intelligence and discipline could master the arcane arts. Rajaat began to take students, to share his knowledge, to spread the understanding of magic across the Green Age world. At first, this seemed like a gift to civilization. Magic offered solutions to problems that had plagued the races since their creation. Healing that surpassed any medicine, transportation faster than any beast, construction that made building effortless. Magic users became valued members of society, advisors to kings, protectors of cities, teachers and scholars who pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But Rajaat's mind had already turned dark. As he delved deeper into the nature of magic and the history of the pristine tower, he uncovered the truth of the rebirth. He learned that the world had once belonged to the halflings, that the races he saw around him were created things, born from genetic manipulation during the desperate final days of the Blue Age. This knowledge poisoned something fundamental in Rajaat's psyche. He came to believe that the rebirth had been a mistake, that the creation of the new races was an abomination, a corruption of the natural order. In Rajaat's twisted philosophy, only the halflings had the right to exist. The humans, elves, dwarves, and all the other races were usurpers, genetic pollutants that had no place in the world. He began to dream of undoing the rebirth, of returning Athas to the Blue Age and the halfling civilization that had been lost. But the halflings who remained were few and diminished, incapable of reclaiming their ancient glory. So Rajaat conceived of a different path to his goal. He would exterminate the new races entirely, systematically eliminating them from existence. Once they were gone, once the world was cleansed of their presence, perhaps the halflings could rise again. Perhaps the Blue Age could return. But Rajaat was one individual, however powerful. He could not wage such a war alone. He would need champions, warriors of unmatched skill and absolute loyalty. He would need to grant them power beyond anything the world had seen, and he would need a weapon, a form of magic so devastating that it could fuel a war of extinction. He created defiling magic, and in doing so, he created the tool that would murder the world itself. You stand now at the threshold of understanding. The Green Age, with all its beauty and potential, was about to end. The Cleansing Wars were coming, and they would leave Athas a desert corpse, forever scarred by the ambitions of one immortal who believed he could undo creation itself. The champions were gathering. The weapons were being forged. And the world had no idea what horror was about to descend upon it. The seas were still full, the forests still grew, the rain still fell, but not for much longer. Section 2. Rajaat the Warbringer and the Birth of Defiling. Rajaat was not born into power. He came into the world as something broken, something wrong, and that wrongness shaped everything he would become. His body was twisted from birth, a malformed thing that marked him as different from other humans. He stood taller than any man, but his height was grotesque, his limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his face bore features that seemed barely human. Children fled from his appearance. Adults looked away in discomfort or disgust. You must understand the depth of his isolation to comprehend what he became. In the cities of the Green Age, where beauty and physical perfection were celebrated, Rajaat was an outcast from his first breath. He could not participate in the normal life of his people. He could not find companionship, could not find love, could not find acceptance anywhere among his own kind. The rejection he faced was not merely social, but existential. He was treated as if he should not exist, as if his very presence was an insult to the natural order. So Rajaat turned away from humanity and toward knowledge. If he could not be accepted for what he was, he would become something greater than acceptance could measure. He threw himself into scholarship with an intensity that bordered on madness. He studied everything he could find: ancient texts, natural philosophy, the fragmentary remains of halfling writings that occasionally surfaced from pre-rebirth ruins. He traveled to the most remote corners of the known world, seeking knowledge that others had forgotten or never discovered. His journeys eventually led him to the pristine tower, that monument to the rebirth that still stood in the far reaches of the world. The tower called to him in ways he could not explain, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. For years, he lived in its shadow, studying its structure, meditating on its purpose, attempting to unlock the secrets it contained. The tower had transformed the world once before. Rajaat became obsessed with the idea that it could be used again, that its power could be harnessed for new purposes. Through his studies at the pristine tower, Rajaat made his first breakthrough. He learned to sense the energy that permeated all living things, the fundamental life force that animated plants and animals and people. This energy was everywhere, invisible to normal sight, but present in every blade of grass, every insect, every drop of water. The pristine tower focused this energy, concentrated it, made it accessible to manipulation. Rajaat discovered that he could draw this energy into himself, pull it from the living things around him, and use it to fuel extraordinary effects. By speaking specific words, making precise gestures, and channeling the energy through his will, he could alter reality itself. He called this discovery magic, arcane magic, and it was fundamentally different from the life-shaping the ancient halflings had practiced. Magic did not require generations of genetic engineering or biological expertise. It required only knowledge, discipline, and the ability to touch the energy that flowed through all life. At first, Rajaat practiced what would later be called preserving magic. He drew energy gently from the plants around him, taking only what they could spare, never enough to harm them. A small circle of grass would yellow and wilt as he cast his spells, but it would recover given time. This was sustainable magic that worked with the natural world rather than against it. If Rajaat had stopped there, if he had been content with this discovery, the history of Athas might have unfolded very differently. But Rajaat was not interested in sustainability. He was interested in power. He began to experiment with drawing more energy, pulling harder on the life force of plants, taking not just what they could spare, but everything they had. When he cast spells this way, the plants around him did not merely wilt, they died. They turned to ash and dust, their life force completely consumed by the magic he channeled. The spells fueled by this method were dramatically more powerful, easier to cast, and capable of effects that preserving magic could never achieve. Rajaat called this defiling magic, and it would become the weapon that murdered the world. The difference between preserving and defiling was not merely a matter of degree. Defiling magic was fundamentally parasitic, fundamentally destructive. Every spell cast through defiling killed the plants in its radius, turning fertile soil into dead ash. More than that, defiling magic was addictive. Once a magic user experienced the rush of power that came from defiling, preserving magic felt weak and unsatisfying by comparison. The temptation to defile, to take more, to fuel your spells with the death of everything around you. That temptation was almost impossible to resist. Rajaat understood the danger of what he had created. He knew that if defiling magic spread unchecked, it could devastate the Green Age world. But by this point in his life, Rajaat had moved far beyond caring about the consequences of his actions. His studies at the pristine tower had uncovered the truth of the rebirth. The knowledge that the races he lived among were created things, born from the genetic manipulation of halflings during the final days of the Blue Age. This revelation crystallized the hatred that had been growing in him since birth. He came to believe that the rebirth had been a cosmic mistake, an abomination that had corrupted the natural order of Athas. The humans, elves, dwarves, and all the other races were genetic pollution, usurpers who had no right to exist. Only the halflings, the original inhabitants of Athas, deserved to live. Rajaat's twisted mind convinced him that if the new races could be eliminated entirely, the world might return to its Blue Age glory. The halflings could rise again, the oceans could return, paradise could be restored. This belief became the core of everything Rajaat would do for the next millennia. He began to teach magic to carefully selected students, spreading the knowledge of both preserving and defiling throughout the world. He presented himself as a benevolent teacher, a wise master sharing miraculous gifts with civilization. His students learned to cast spells, to heal wounds, to protect cities, to accomplish wonders that made them heroes and legends. Magic spread across the Green Age like fire through dry grass, and with it, the seeds of destruction spread as well. But teaching magic to the masses was only the first step in Rajaat's plan. For the genocide he envisioned, he would need something more than ordinary magic users. He would need champions of unmatched power, warriors who could wage war against entire species and win. He would need individuals who were absolutely loyal to him, who would carry out his orders without question or hesitation. And he would need to transform these individuals into something beyond mortality, something that could sustain a war lasting centuries or even millennia. Rajaat spent centuries searching for his champions. He looked for individuals who possessed extraordinary martial skill, yes, but also specific psychological profiles. He needed people who could be made to hate, who could be convinced that genocide was not merely acceptable, but necessary. He needed people with ambition, with ruthlessness, with the capacity for sustained violence on a scale that would horrify ordinary minds. He needed people who wanted power badly enough that they would do absolutely anything to obtain it. One by one, he found them. 15 individuals, each exceptional in their own way, each harboring deep wells of ambition and potential for cruelty. They came from different races and different backgrounds. Some were already warriors of renown. Others were nobles or merchants or outcasts. What united them was their willingness to follow Rajaat, to accept his teachings, to become his instruments. Rajaat did not reveal his true purpose to them immediately. He presented himself as a teacher of advanced magic, offering them power beyond what any normal magic user could achieve. He taught them secrets of defiling that he had shared with no one else, showing them how to draw staggering amounts of energy from the living world. He trained them in combat enhanced by magic, in strategies of warfare, in the domination of lesser minds. For years, sometimes decades, he shaped each champion into a weapon of war. When they were ready, when he judged them sufficiently skilled and sufficiently corrupted by the power he had given them, Rajaat brought them to the pristine tower. Here, he would transform them into something new, something that had never existed before. Using the tower's power combined with his mastery of magic, Rajaat performed rituals of staggering complexity on each champion. He bound them to specific tasks, specific races they would be responsible for exterminating. He altered their bodies, making them stronger, faster, more resilient than any mortal could be. He extended their lifespans, granting them millennia to complete their assigned missions. Most significantly, he placed them on the path to becoming dragons. The dragon transformation was Rajaat's crowning achievement in magical research. By channeling vast amounts of defiling energy through a specific series of metamorphic stages, a magic user could gradually transform themselves into a dragon, a creature of immense power that combined arcane mastery with physical might. The transformation was not instantaneous. It required centuries of sustained defiling magic, each stage bringing the champion closer to their final draconic form. But the promise of that ultimate power, the promise of becoming a dragon, was irresistible to the champions Rajaat had selected. He named them his champions of Rajaat, and he assigned each one a specific race to destroy. Boris, who would become known as the Butcher, received the task of exterminating the dwarves. Hamanyu, given the title Troll Scorcher, would eliminate the trolls. Kalak would hunt the ogres. Sacha Arala, the curse of kobolds, would destroy the kobolds. Sealba would pursue the Terrans. Dregoth was assigned to annihilate the giants. Each champion received their assignment, their sacred mission in Rajaat's Cleansing Wars. The champions did not initially understand the full scope of what they had agreed to. They believed they were preparing for war against dangerous enemies, perhaps against races that threatened civilization. Rajaat had carefully framed his mission in terms they could accept, painting the targeted races as threats that needed to be eliminated for the good of the world. Only gradually, as the campaigns began, did the champions come to understand that Rajaat intended total genocide, the complete extinction of every race except the halflings. By then, they were already committed. They had already taken the first steps on the path to becoming dragons. They had already begun killing. And the power they wielded was so intoxicating, so absolute, that moral considerations became increasingly irrelevant. They were becoming gods, or so they believed. And gods do not concern themselves with the morality of mortals. Rajaat gave them armies. He taught magic to thousands upon thousands of soldiers, creating vast forces of defilers who would support the champions in their campaigns. He established training centers where new magic users were constantly produced, ensuring a steady supply of warriors for the wars to come. He developed weapons and tactics specifically designed for the systematic extermination of entire populations. Everything was planned. Everything was prepared, down to the smallest detail. In the city he built for himself, a place called Draxa, hidden in the deepest desert, Rajaat gathered his champions and gave them their final instructions. The Cleansing Wars would begin simultaneously on multiple fronts. Each champion would lead their armies into the territories of their assigned race and would not stop until every last individual was dead. There would be no prisoners, no mercy, no exceptions. This was war not for conquest, but for extinction. The champions accepted their missions. They dispersed across the Green Age world, leading their armies to the borders of their enemies. They prepared their spells and sharpened their weapons. They gathered their defiling magic users and positioned them for maximum devastation. Everything was ready. The world, still green and growing, still beautiful and alive, had no idea what was about to descend upon it. Rajaat stood in the pristine tower and felt satisfaction for perhaps the first time in his long, bitter life. His plan was in motion. His champions were deployed. The magic he had discovered would fuel a war that would reshape the world itself. He did not think about the environmental consequences of sustained defiling on such a massive scale. He did not consider what would happen to the water, the forests, the very climate of Athas, when millions upon millions of plants were killed to fuel his genocide. He thought only of the blue age he would restore, the halfling paradise he would bring back, the vindication of his belief that the rebirth had been a mistake. In his mind, he was not destroying the world. He was saving it. The Cleansing Wars were about to begin, and Athas would never be the same. Section 3. The Cleansing Wars Unleashed. The first battles of the Cleansing Wars began approximately 3,500 years before what would become known as the Free Year, the Year of Tears Liberation. The forests of Athas withered and died as the champions unleashed their armies and their magic upon the world. What followed was not war as the Green Age understood it. This was extermination conducted with methodical precision. You need to picture the scale of these early campaigns to understand the horror they represented. The targeted races were not merely killed in battle. They were hunted down in their homes, in their villages, in the caves and fortresses where they sought shelter. The champions employed magic users by the hundreds, defilers who could locate populations through scrying and divination. Once located, entire communities were surrounded, cut off from escape routes, and systematically destroyed. Every settlement that fell was subjected to total annihilation. The warriors were killed first, cut down by coordinated magical assaults and conventional weapons. Then came the elders, the craftspeople, the caretakers. Finally, the children. The champions showed no hesitation in ordering the death of children. In their minds, these were simply future threats who would one day need to be hunted. Every child killed was one fewer member of the targeted race who would need to be eliminated later. The soldiers, corrupted by years of service under Rajaat and empowered by defiling magic, carried out these orders without question. They had been taught to see their targets not as people, but as obstacles, problems to be eliminated. The environmental cost of these campaigns became apparent almost immediately. Every major battle involved hundreds or thousands of defilers casting spells simultaneously. When a defiler cast a spell in the Green Age, the plants in a radius around them died instantly, their life force ripped away and consumed. The soil itself was transformed, stripped of all nutrients and organic matter, reduced to sterile ash. Now imagine a battlefield where 500 defilers are casting spells every few seconds. The ground beneath their feet turned black. Trees that had stood for centuries withered and crumbled to dust. Grass that had covered the hills became smoking ash. Entire forests died in the span of hours as the defiling magic consumed everything living. But it was not just the battlefields that suffered. The the armies needed to be sustained during their campaigns, and that meant constant use of magic for basic necessities. Defilers cast spells to purify water, to preserve food, to maintain equipment, to communicate across distances. Every one of these spells killed more plants. The routes the armies marched along became corridors of devastation, strips of dead earth cutting through what had been green and growing land. Boris, assigned to exterminate the dwarves, approached his task with methodical precision. Where some champions were brutal and overwhelming, Boris was systematic. He planned his campaigns carefully, cutting off supply lines, isolating dwarf communities, and then moving in for total elimination. The dwarves, with their legendary focus and determination, fought back with everything they had. They fortified their mountain strongholds, created elaborate defensive works, and refused to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. But their stubbornness only prolonged their suffering. Boris had time, centuries if necessary, and he had the power to simply outlast any defense. Hamanyu, assigned to exterminate the trolls, took a different approach. Where Boris was methodical, Hamanyu was brutal and overwhelming. He did not bother with careful planning or strategic positioning. He simply unleashed his armies in wave after wave of assault, throwing magic users and soldiers at troll settlements until nothing remained alive. The trolls, with their ability to regenerate from almost any wound, required special tactics to kill permanently. Fire became Hamanyu's preferred weapon. Troll villages burned, not just the buildings, but everything surrounding them. Hamanyu's defilers cast firestorms that consumed entire regions, creating infernos so intense that the very soil was sterilized. The trolls died screaming in flames that magical regeneration could not overcome. And when the fires finally burned out, nothing remained but ash and charred bone. The land where troll communities had thrived became blackened wastelands where nothing would grow for generations. The other champions pursued their own campaigns with equal ruthlessness. Dregoth focused on the giants, hunting them through mountain ranges and remote valleys. Kalak hunted the ogres through swamps and wetlands, using magic to drain entire marshes and expose his prey. Sacha Arala destroyed the kobolds, small and numerous, requiring different tactics than the larger races. Sealba pursued the Terrans, the reptilian race that had inhabited the rocky Badlands. Each champion developed their own methods, their own signature approaches to genocide. What united all these campaigns was the staggering scale of defiling magic being employed. Rajaat had trained tens of thousands of magic users, and they were all practicing defilers. None of them had been taught preserving techniques. None of them cared about the environmental impact of their spells. They cast magic constantly, carelessly, drawing life force from the world around them without thought for the consequences. The forests began to die first. Great woodlands that had stood since the early Green Age withered and fell. The trees closest to the battlefields and marching routes died outright, turned to ash by concentrated defiling. But the damage spread far beyond the immediate zones of destruction. Plants reproduce through seeds, through root systems, through interconnected ecological relationships. When large sections of a forest die, the surviving sections become vulnerable. They lose their protection against disease, against parasites, against climate variation. What defiling magic did not kill directly, it killed through cascading ecological collapse. The climate itself began to change. Forests regulate temperature and rainfall through transpiration, the process by which trees release water vapor into the atmosphere. As millions upon millions of trees died, this regulation failed. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had received reliable seasonal rains found those rains diminishing or disappearing entirely. The air became drier, hotter, more hostile to life. Water sources suffered catastrophically. The champions understood that populations needed water to survive, and they used this knowledge strategically. When hunting a particular race, they would target the water sources that race depended upon. Rivers were poisoned through magical contamination. Springs were collapsed through earth-moving spells that required massive amounts of defiling. Lakes were drained, their water magically evaporated or transported elsewhere, leaving behind toxic mineral deposits and dead fish rotting in mud. But even when water sources were not deliberately targeted, they suffered from the ambient devastation of the wars. Rivers depend on watershed forests to maintain their flow. When those forests died, the rivers began to shrink. Streams that had run year-round became seasonal trickles. Lakes fed by those streams began to recede, their shorelines retreating as the water level dropped. The Green Age water cycle, which had sustained abundant life for thousands of years, was breaking down under the relentless assault of defiling magic. The ruins that exist today across the tablelands bear witness to battles and massacres that occurred during the Cleansing Wars. Camelot, now a ruin explored by those brave or foolish enough to venture there, stands as one example of a place that suffered during these conflicts. Based on what we know of how the wars were conducted, we can imagine that battles at such sites would have followed similar patterns. Coordinated defiling assaults, massive environmental devastation, and the complete annihilation of defending populations. The sterile ash and lifeless soil found in such ruins today suggest the intensity of magical combat that once raged there. What is certain is that wherever the champions and their armies fought, the land died. The defiling was so intense, so concentrated in certain locations, that it permanently altered the fundamental nature of the terrain. Places that had been fertile valleys became barren wastelands. Forests became ash fields. Rivers became dry channels. And these changes were not temporary. The soil had been stripped of everything that made it capable of supporting life. Even today, more than 3,000 years after the Cleansing Wars ended, many of these sites remain completely dead. The races targeted for extinction fought back when they could, forming alliances and attempting coordinated resistance. But they were fighting an enemy that had been specifically designed to destroy them. The champions were on their path to becoming dragons, growing more powerful with each passing year. They could not be killed by conventional means. Wounds that would slay a normal person healed in moments on a champion's body. Poisons had no effect. Even magical attacks, unless extraordinarily powerful, failed to cause lasting harm. More than that, the champions commanded the loyalty of vast armies who believed absolutely in their cause. Rajaat had spent centuries indoctrinating his followers, teaching them that the cleansing wars were necessary, that the targeted races were abominations that needed to be removed from the world. The soldiers who marched under the champions' banners genuinely believed they were saving Athas, not destroying it. This ideological commitment made them even more dangerous than mere mercenaries or conscripts would have been. As the wars continued year after year, decade after decade, the environmental devastation accumulated. It was not just the forests and grasslands that died. Entire ecosystems collapsed as keystone species were eliminated. The giants, for instance, had been crucial in maintaining mountain habitats. Their movements through the high passes created trails that other animals used. Their activities in alpine meadows influenced plant distribution. When the giants were exterminated, these functions disappeared, and the mountain ecosystems began to degrade. The toll on water became increasingly severe as the centuries passed. The Green Age had possessed vast oceans, inland seas, countless rivers and lakes. These water bodies began to shrink as the plant life that sustained them died. Ocean levels dropped as rainfall decreased. Inland seas became smaller, their water increasingly saline as evaporation outpaced replenishment. Rivers that had been navigable by large vessels became shallow streams that could barely float a small boat. Some regions suffered more than others. Areas where multiple champions conducted campaigns simultaneously experienced devastation, so complete that they became uninhabitable. The Central Plains, once the breadbasket of several civilizations, turned to dust and ash. The great forests, which had covered vast areas, were reduced to scattered dead trees standing like grave markers over lifeless soil. Wetlands that had been home to incredible biodiversity dried into cracked mud flats where nothing lived. The civilian populations caught between the warring forces suffered beyond measure. Farms failed as the land died. Irrigation systems that had functioned for generations stopped working as the rivers that fed them disappeared. Famines spread across the world, killing millions who had nothing to do with the wars themselves. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were abandoned as their water sources failed and their food supplies collapsed. Refugees fled the devastated regions, trying to find places where life could still be sustained. But there were fewer and fewer such places. With each passing year, the Green Age was ending, not in some distant future, but right now, visibly, as the defiling magic consumed everything it touched. People who had lived their entire lives in abundance found themselves struggling to find clean water, to grow enough food to survive another season, to simply endure in a world that was becoming hostile to life itself. The champions noticed the devastation, of course. They saw the forests dying, the water disappearing, the land turning to desert. Some of them began to question whether Rajaat's vision could be achieved in a world that was being destroyed so completely. But they were already too deep into the transformation to dragon form, already too committed to their missions, already too corrupted by the power they wielded. They told themselves the devastation was temporary, that once the cleansing wars were complete, the world could recover. They told themselves lies, because the truth was too terrible to acknowledge. Rajaat himself remained in Urdraxa, observing the wars through magical scrying and receiving reports from his champions. If he felt any concern about the environmental collapse his wars were causing, he never expressed it. In his mind, the destruction of the Green Age was acceptable, even desirable. The world would be returned to the Blue Age. The oceans would rise again. The halflings would reclaim their birthright. The fact that this vision was completely divorced from reality did not trouble him. Rajaat had long since abandoned any connection to sanity or truth. He saw only what he wanted to see, believed only what served his purposes. The cleansing wars raged for over 1,000 years. Some sources suggest even longer, perhaps 1,500 years or more of sustained genocide and environmental destruction. Generation after generation was born into war, lived in war, died in war. The original reasons for the conflicts were forgotten by common soldiers. They knew only that they served their champion, that they fought the enemy, that defiling magic gave them power. The world they were destroying was the only world they had ever known, and they could not imagine that it had once been different. But those who lived long enough, who had memories stretching back to the early Green Age, they remembered. They remembered forests where now there was only dust. They remembered rivers that had become dry channels. They remembered rain that no longer fell. And they understood with growing horror that the cleansing wars were not just killing the targeted races. They were killing Athas itself. Section 4. Betrayal, Imprisonment, and Transformation. The champions learned the truth in fragments, piecing together Rajaat's ultimate vision over decades of whispering doubts and stolen glances at forbidden texts. They had slaughtered entire species until the mountains and valleys echoed with silence. They had burned forests until entire regions became ash wastelands. They had hunted their assigned races to the edge of extinction, believing they served a vision of human dominance over Athas. They had watched the Green Age die around them, the forests withering to desert, the seas receding into silt, the very air growing hot and hostile. They had become something more than mortal through their service, walking the path toward becoming dragons, wielding power that made them living gods in the eyes of ordinary people. But the genocide was not finished, and Rajaat showed no signs of ending the wars. More targets appeared on his lists. More races were marked for extermination. The champions had assumed that once the designated races were eliminated, the Cleansing Wars would end. They believed humans would inherit Athas, ruling over a world purified of the races Rajaat deemed abominations. They thought themselves heirs to a transformed world, architect gods who would shape civilization according to their own designs. They were wrong about everything. You must understand the moment of revelation to grasp the betrayal that followed. One of the champions, through deep study of Rajaat's notes, or perhaps through magical scrying into his true thoughts, discovered what the Warbringer had never intended to reveal. Rajaat's goal was not human supremacy. His vision was not a world ruled by the champions and their descendants. He intended to return Athas to the Blue Age, to restore the world to the halflings who had ruled during that ancient oceanic paradise. And that meant every race created during the rebirth had to be eliminated. Every single one, including humans. The champions themselves, despite their power and their service, were marked for eventual extermination. They were simply tools Rajaat was using to accomplish the bulk of his genocide before disposing of them like any other created race. All their ambitions, all their dreams of ruling a cleansed world, all the power they had been promised, these were lies. They had murdered entire species and destroyed the world itself in service to a master who intended to kill them the moment they were no longer useful. The rage that followed this discovery was absolute. The champions had committed atrocities that could never be undone. They had stained themselves with genocides that would echo through eternity. They had watched the Green Age die and knew themselves responsible for its death. And they had done all of this believing they were securing a future for themselves and their kind, to learn that it had all been manipulation, that Rajaat had played them from the beginning, that they were always meant to be victims of their own genocide. This truth broke something fundamental in their relationship with their master. But rage alone would not be enough to defeat the first sorcerer. Rajaat was the most powerful being on Athas, the discoverer of magic itself, an immortal who had walked the world for thousands of years and mastered powers the champions could barely comprehend. He had created them, transformed them, set them on the path to becoming dragons. He knew their strengths and weaknesses intimately. A direct confrontation would likely end with the champions destroyed, and Rajaat simply selecting new servants to continue his work. They would need to be clever. They would need surprise. They would need a weapon capable of constraining or destroying a being as powerful as Rajaat. And they would need absolute unity among themselves, because if even one champion remained loyal to Rajaat and warned him of the conspiracy, all would be lost. The conspiracy formed slowly, carefully, with the champions meeting in secret and shielding their thoughts from Rajaat's divinations. Not all of them joined immediately. Some struggled with the idea of turning against the master, who had given them everything. Others feared that even united, they lacked the power to defeat him. But the alternative was their own extinction, and that knowledge eventually brought most of them into the fold. The champions studied the problem of Rajaat as they might study any enemy, looking for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities, for any crack in the armor of the first sorcerer's power. And slowly, they conceived of a plan that might actually work. Rajaat could not be killed. The champions quickly determined this through their research and their understanding of the magics that sustained him. He had made himself effectively immortal through transformations and bindings that went far beyond even the dragon metamorphosis he had started his champions upon. Any attack that would kill a normal being, even a normal epic-level magic user, would at best inconvenience Rajaat temporarily. His essence would endure, would reconstitute, would return to plague them. But what could not be killed might be imprisoned. The champions proposed separating Rajaat's essence from his physical form, splitting the unity that made him so dangerous into component parts that could be contained separately. The physical remains would be sealed in one location, the spiritual essence in another. Neither component alone would possess the full power of the unified Rajaat. And if the prisons were strong enough, if the magical bindings were sufficiently powerful, Rajaat might be contained indefinitely. To accomplish this, they would need the Dark Lens. The Dark Lens was an artifact of staggering power, created by Rajaat himself during his years of magical experimentation. It served as a focus and amplifier for both arcane and psionic energies, allowing the user to channel power on a scale that would normally be impossible. Rajaat had used the Dark Lens in conjunction with the pristine tower to transform his champions in the first place, to set them on the path to dragon metamorphosis, and bind them to their genocidal missions. Now the champions would steal that same artifact and turn it against their creator. The theft of the Dark Lens required careful timing and misdirection. Rajaat kept the artifact secured in Urdraxa, his hidden city deep in the most desolate wastes of the dying world. The champions manufactured reasons to be away from the city, to be conducting campaigns in distant regions. They coordinated their movements so that when the theft occurred, they would all be positioned to move quickly to the site they had chosen for their final confrontation with Rajaat. The theft was discovered almost immediately, but by then it was too late. The conspiracy was in motion. Rajaat's fury when he discovered the betrayal was apocalyptic. He summoned those champions who had remained loyal to him, Only two answered that call. Sacha-Arala, the curse of kobolds, and Wyan of Bodach both chose to stand with Rajaat against their fellow champions. Perhaps they truly believed in his vision. Perhaps they feared him too much to rebel. Perhaps they simply hated the other champions more than they feared their own eventual extinction. Whatever their reasons, their loyalty would cost them dearly. The final battle between Rajaat and his rebellious champions took place at a location the rebels had prepared specifically for this confrontation. They chose ground where they could establish defensive positions and where the dark lens could be properly utilized. They arrayed themselves in formations designed to maximize their combined power while minimizing the effectiveness of Rajaat's counterattacks. And they brought with them every magical weapon, every artifact, every source of power they had accumulated during their centuries of war. Rajaat came to them like a storm given form. His physical body had long since been transformed into something that barely resembled the deformed human he had once been. He towered over the battlefield, wreathed in shadows and crackling energy, his voice shaking the earth when he spoke. The two loyal champions, Sacha and Wyan, stood at his sides, ready to defend their master against the traitors. The battle that followed was beyond anything the Cleansing Wars had yet witnessed. Rajaat wielded defiling magic on a scale that made even the champion's most devastating spells seem like candle flames compared to an inferno. The ground beneath the battlefield died instantly. Every plant within miles reduced to ash in the first moments of combat. The sky itself seemed to darken as Rajaat drew upon power sources the champions had never imagined. He cast spells that should have been impossible, effects that violated the known principles of magic. The champions fought with desperate coordination. They had planned this battle for months, or perhaps years, working out strategies and contingencies for every situation they could imagine. They struck from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing Rajaat to divide his attention. And they defended each other, intervening when Rajaat focused his devastating power on any single champion. Boris of Ebb, known as the Butcher, was among the most physically powerful of the champions, and he had progressed further along the path to dragon transformation than most of his fellows. His attacks were relentless, forcing Rajaat to focus enormous energy on defense. While Rajaat was occupied, the other champions worked to position the dark lens and prepare the spell that would split their master's essence from his form. The two loyal champions, Sacha and Wyan, fought viciously to protect Rajaat and disrupt the rebels' plans. They cast their own devastating magics, trying to break the formation the rebels had established. For a time, the battle balanced on a knife's edge, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The defiling magic being unleashed by both sides created a zone of such complete devastation that the land would never recover. The very earth cracked and split. what little water remained in the area boiled away. The temperature soared to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Then the champions completed their spell. Using the dark lens to amplify their combined power to unimaginable levels, the champions cast a working of such complexity that it would never be replicated. The spell reached into the fundamental nature of Rajaat's being and tore it asunder. His essence, the spiritual component that made him who and what he was, separated from his physical form. For a moment, Rajaat existed in two places simultaneously, his body standing on the battlefield, while his essence hung suspended in magical bonds only the champions could perceive. That moment was enough. Rajaat's attacks ceased as he struggled to reintegrate himself. His body, deprived of the animating essence, began to lose cohesion. And in that moment of vulnerability, the champions struck with everything they had. But even separated, Rajaat was too powerful to simply destroy. His physical remains, though no longer animated by his essence, resisted all attempts to disintegrate or banish them. His essence, though bound by the champion's spell, fought against the magical chains with strength that threatened to shatter them. The champions realized they would need to create prisons specifically designed to contain each component. Using the dark lens and working with speed born of desperation, the champions created the Hollow. This was not a physical place, but rather a pocket dimension, a space that existed beyond the normal planes of existence. The Hollow was fashioned as a prison from which escape should be impossible. There were no walls to break, no locks to pick, no physical constraints that could be overcome. The Hollow was simply absence, a void where Rajaat's essence could exist, but could never act. Into this Hollow, the champions cast Rajaat's essence. The first sorcerer's spiritual component vanished from the battlefield, hurled into the prison they had created. But even trapped in that void, Rajaat's power was such that he would eventually find ways to influence the material world if the prison was not constantly maintained. The prison would require a guardian, someone to maintain the magical bindings and prevent Rajaat's essence from escaping. For Rajaat's physical remains, the champions created a different kind of prison. They fashioned a cyst of enchanted stone, a sphere of black material that would later be called the Black Sphere, or the Black. This sphere would contain Rajaat's physical body, preventing it from reconstituting or being used as a focus for his essence to return to the material world. The champions concealed this black sphere in a location that would remain secret. The battle was won, but the cost of maintaining Rajaat's imprisonment would be staggering. The Hollow was not self-sustaining. It required constant infusions of magical energy to prevent Rajaat's essence from eroding the barriers that held him, and that energy would need to come from defiling magic on a massive scale, requiring the sacrifice of countless living things to fuel the prison. The champions understood what this meant. One of them would have to serve as jailer, dedicating themselves to maintaining Rajaat's prison. This champion would need power beyond what any of them currently possessed. They would need to complete the transformation to full dragon form, achieving the ultimate metamorphosis Rajaat had promised them. Only a fully transformed dragon would have sufficient power to keep the first sorcerer contained. Boris was chosen for this role. He was among the strongest of the champions and had progressed far along the dragon path. Using the dark lens once more, the champions performed a ritual of transformation on Boris. They channeled staggering amounts of magical energy through him, accelerating his dragon metamorphosis through multiple stages in a matter of hours rather than the centuries it should have taken. The amount of defiling required was apocalyptic. Entire regions died to fuel Boris's transformation. But when the ritual was complete, Boris had become something new. He was the dragon, the first and only fully transformed dragon on Athas. His power was immense, terrible, beyond anything the world had seen except for Rajaat himself. But the transformation had consequences beyond simple power. The rapid acceleration of the metamorphosis, compressing centuries of gradual change into a few hours, damaged Boris's mind. The dragon that emerged from the ritual was barely sane, a creature of immense power but diminished reason. For years afterward, Boris would rampage across what remained of the Green Age, destroying everything in his path, killing thousands, devastating regions that had somehow survived the Cleansing Wars. Only gradually, over decades, would his sanity return enough for him to assume his role as Rajaat's jailer. The other champions underwent their own transformations, though less dramatic than Boris's. They had already been walking the path to dragon metamorphosis. Now, they advanced that path further, using the power and knowledge they had gained. They did not complete the transformation as Boris had. They learned from his madness, understanding that the final stages required slow, careful progression or risk losing themselves entirely. But they transformed enough to become beings of such power that they could claim rulership over the dying world. They became the Sorcerer-Kings, and they divided Athas among themselves. Each champion claimed a city or founded a new one, establishing themselves as absolute rulers. They were living gods to the populations that survived in these urban centers, beings who could not be challenged or opposed. They commanded armies, maintained bureaucracies, enforced laws with magic and terror. And they continued to defile, continuing to drain life from the world to fuel their magic and advance their slow transformation toward full dragon status. The two champions who had remained loyal to Rajaat, Sacha and Wyan, faced execution for their betrayal of the rebellion. Boris, before his madness fully consumed him, personally beheaded both of them, but champions could not be killed so easily. They had been transformed by Rajaat's magic, made effectively immortal. Sacha and Wyan survived as disembodied heads, undead things that continued to exist in a state of torment. They could still speak, still think, still wield magic to some degree. The other champions kept them as examples and as sources of information, forcing them to serve the very rebels they had opposed. The world these new Sorcerer-Kings inherited was dying. The Cleansing Wars had lasted over 1,500 years, and every day of those wars had contributed to the environmental collapse that was now accelerating beyond control. The forests were gone. The grasslands had become dust. The rivers had dried to trickles or disappeared entirely. The great oceans of the Green Age were transforming into something new and terrible, the Sea of Silt, a deadly expanse of fine dust that drowned travelers as effectively as water ever had. But the Sorcerer-Kings did not change their ways. They continued to practice defiling magic. They taught defiling to their followers and servants. Every spell cast in their cities, every magical effect used to maintain their power, drew life from an already devastated world. They knew what they were doing. They saw the consequences every day. But they were committed to the path of dragon transformation, and that path required defiling on a massive scale. They had already destroyed the Green Age. What was a little more devastation weighed against their personal power? Each Sorcerer-King ruled their city-state as they saw fit. Hamanyu took the city of Uruk and ruled with brutal military efficiency. Naibne withdrew into mystery and philosophical contemplation, but still maintained iron control over his domain. Lalalipai presented herself as a forest goddess to the people of Gulg, even as she continued defiling magic. Each adopted their own methods, their own philosophies of rule, but all were fundamentally the same. They were tyrants, immortal despots who had murdered millions during the Cleansing Wars and now lorded over the survivors in a world they had destroyed. The populations that survived in the city-states existed in desperate circumstances. Water was scarce and strictly controlled. Food came from whatever could be grown in the ash-choked soil or imported from distant sources. Slavery became the foundation of the economy, with the Sorcerer-Kings claiming ownership of most of their populations and trading slaves as commodities. Freedom was a privilege, granted or revoked at the whim of rulers who saw their subjects as tools rather than people. Beyond the cities, the world became a wasteland. The regions between the Sorcerer-King's domains were deserts of sand and stone, places where water existed only in hidden pockets, and life clung to existence through desperate adaptation. Travelers who attempted to cross these wastes faced heat that could kill in hours, storms of silt that could bury entire caravans, and predators that had evolved to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. Boris, when his sanity returned enough to allow coherent action, established a system to fuel the prison that held Rajaat. Each year, the Sorcerer-Kings would be required to provide him with a levy, often paid in slaves or treasure. This levy would help fuel the defiling magic that maintained the hollow and kept Rajaat contained. The Sorcerer-Kings grumbled at this burden, but complied. They feared Rajaat more than they resented Boris's demands. If the Warbringer ever escaped, he would complete his genocide. He would exterminate humans and every other race. He would kill the Sorcerer-Kings themselves. So they paid the levy year after year, sacrificing resources to maintain a prison they dared not let fail. You stand now in the world the champions created through their betrayal and their continued rule. Rajaat is imprisoned, his essence locked in the hollow, his body hidden in the black sphere, but the price of that imprisonment is paid continually in defiling magic and the resources demanded by the dragon. The Sorcerer-Kings rule their city-states as immortal tyrants, slowly advancing toward their goal of full dragon transformation, while the world continues to die around them. This is the legacy of the champions' betrayal. They saved themselves from Rajaat's genocide. They claimed power and immortality. They became the rulers of Athas, and in doing so, they ensured that the devastation the Cleansing Wars had begun would never end. The world continues to die, not from war now, but from the simple, everyday practice of defiling magic. Every spell cast, every magical effect maintained, every step the Sorcerer-Kings take toward full dragon transformation. These drain more life from an already dying world. Section 5. The Desert World and Eternal Legacy. The transformation is complete, or as complete as it will ever be, until the final grain of sand settles over the last remnant of life. You look upon Athas today and see a world that has been murdered so thoroughly that even its corpse continues to decay. The Green Age is gone, not merely ended, but erased, with only scattered ruins and fading memories to prove it ever existed at all. The Blue Age before that is legend myth, a story so ancient that most believe it never happened. But the desert, the endless burning desert beneath the crimson sun, this is reality. This is the legacy of Rajaat and his champions, of the Cleansing Wars and the magic that fueled them. The oceans died slowly, and their death was perhaps the most profound transformation of all. Water, that fundamental requirement for life, did not simply vanish. It could not vanish, not entirely, but water can change, can be locked away, can become inaccessible to the living things that need it. As the forests died and the grasslands turned to dust, as millions upon millions of plants were killed to fuel defiling magic, the water cycle that had sustained the Green Age collapsed entirely. Rain became rare, then vanishingly scarce, then almost mythical in most regions. The clouds that had once brought seasonal storms simply stopped forming. Without forests to release moisture into the atmosphere through transpiration, without living plants to create the conditions that generate precipitation, the sky remained clear and merciless. The sun beat down day after day, week after week, year after year, without relief. The temperature rose, not dramatically at first, but steadily, relentlessly, until the baseline climate of Athas was hotter than the worst heat waves of the Green Age. The sun itself changed color over time. What had been blue during the ancient times became yellow during the Green Age after the rebirth. Now, in the current age, it burns crimson in the sky. Though whether this transformation resulted from the pristine tower's influence, the accumulated defiling magic, or some other cause, remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the crimson sun now dominates a sky that offers no mercy to those beneath it. The great oceans, deprived of rainfall to replenish what evaporation took, began to shrink. Their shorelines receded year by year, century by century. Fish populations collapsed as their habitats diminished. Marine ecosystems simply ceased to exist. What had been deep ocean became shallow sea, then became tidal flats, then became exposed land covered with salt and mineral deposits. But the most dramatic change, the transformation that defines Athas in its current age, was the creation of the Sea of Silt. As the ocean levels dropped and the exposed seabeds dried under the relentless sun, the soil itself broke down into powder, fine sediment, ground by wind and time into particles smaller than sand, began to accumulate in the vast basins where oceans had once been. This silt was not like beach sand. It was finer, lighter, more like talcum powder or volcanic ash. And it was deadly in ways that water had never been. The Sea of Silt appears from a distance like a normal body of water, gray-white and shimmering in the heat. But you cannot swim in it. You cannot float on its surface. If you step into the Sea of Silt without protection, you sink immediately, drowning in dust as surely as you would drown in water. The silt fills your lungs, chokes off your air, pulls you down into suffocating death. Entire caravans have been lost to the Sea of Silt, disappearing without a trace into its depths. Some have learned to traverse the Sea of Silt using specialized vessels, ships that sail on runners or float on air magic, staying above the surface rather than trying to displace it like water. These silt skimmers make trade possible between regions separated by the sea. But the journey is always dangerous. Storms of silt, lifted by wind into choking clouds, can destroy ships and kill crews in minutes. Predators adapted to the silt environment lurk beneath the surface. Creatures that have evolved to swim through dust as their ancestors once swam through water. The water that remains on Athas exists in isolated pockets, jealously guarded and fought over with a desperation that colors every aspect of life. Underground springs, carefully concealed, become the foundations of settlements. Oases scattered across the desert wastes are controlled through violence and defended with every resource available. Cities that still possess functioning wells or access to underground aquifers wield that water as a weapon, granting or denying it to control their populations absolutely. The Sorcerer-Kings understand the power of water in this dying world. They control every drop that flows through their city-states. Public wells are monitored constantly, with guards ensuring that no one takes more than their allotted share. Private cisterns are illegal in most cities because any water hoarded by individuals is water that cannot be used to maintain the Sorcerer-King's control. The punishment for stealing water is often death, and the punishments are public, brutal, designed to terrify the population into compliance. The city-states themselves stand as isolated points of relative safety in an ocean of desolation. Each is ruled by one of the surviving champions, now calling themselves Sorcerer-Kings, regardless of their gender, wielding power that makes them effectively gods to their subjects. The populations of these cities range from tens of thousands to perhaps a few 100,000. And these populations represent the majority of human life remaining on Athas. Beyond the city walls lies the desert, the silt, the wastes where only the desperate or the well-prepared venture. Tyr, ruled for millennia by Kalak until recent events, stands as one of the great city-states. Its iron mines and strategic location making it crucial to trade and warfare alike. Uruk, under Hamanyu's brutal military dictatorship, maintains the largest and most disciplined army on Athas. Ram, chaotic and overcrowded, suffers under rule that struggles to maintain order. Gulg, hidden in the forest that Lalalipai has somehow preserved through methods that remain unclear, maintains traditions and practices that seem alien to the other city-states. Balak, Draj, Naibne, each city-state has its own character, its own customs, its own particular flavor of tyranny. But beneath their superficial differences, all the city-states share fundamental characteristics. All are built on slavery. All are ruled by immortal despots. All continue to practice defiling magic, and all exist in a state of precarious survival. Always one drought, or one failed harvest, or one military defeat away from collapse. Slavery is the economic foundation of every city-state on Athas. The majority of each population is legally owned, property that can be bought and sold and disposed of according to the whims of masters. Slaves work the fields outside the city walls, growing meager crops in soil that grows less productive with each passing year. Slaves mine the resources that fuel trade and manufacturing. Slaves build the monuments and temples that glorify their Sorcerer-King rulers. Slaves fight in the gladiatorial arenas that provide entertainment and serve as tools of political control. The distinction between slave and free is often minimal in practical terms. Free citizens still live under absolute tyranny. They can be conscripted for labor or military service at any moment. They possess only those rights their Sorcerer-King chooses to grant them, and those rights can be revoked without explanation or appeal. The primary advantage of freedom is that free citizens can own property, including slaves, and can theoretically improve their position through commerce or service. But wealth and status are always precarious, always subject to confiscation if a Sorcerer King decides they want what you have. The gladiatorial arenas serve multiple purposes in this society. They provide spectacle and distraction for populations that might otherwise turn their desperation into rebellion. They serve as execution grounds for criminals and inconvenient individuals. They function as proving grounds for warriors, with successful gladiators sometimes earning their freedom or positions of privilege. And they consume slaves in vast numbers, feeding the population's hunger for violent entertainment, while reducing the resource burden of maintaining large slave populations. Magic in the city-states is practiced predominantly as defiling. The Sorcerer Kings teach defiling to their servants and Templars, creating cadres of magic users who enforce their will and maintain order. These defilers draw their power from the already devastated world, killing what little plant life still manages to survive in order to fuel their spells. The areas immediately surrounding the city-states are completely dead, reduced to ash and stone by centuries of constant defiling. To find plants with enough life force to power significant magic, defilers must travel farther and farther from the cities, extending the circles of devastation ever outward. Preservers, those magic users who refuse to defile and instead draw only what energy plants can spare without dying, are hunted and persecuted in most city-states. The Sorcerer Kings view preservers as threats to their power and to the established order. A preserver's very existence is an implicit criticism of defiling, a suggestion that another way is possible. This cannot be tolerated. The Templars hunt preservers relentlessly, torturing them when they are caught, executing them publicly as warnings to others who might consider preserving magic. Yet preservers endure. They practice in secret, hiding their abilities, moving constantly to avoid detection. Some form underground networks, sharing knowledge and resources, protecting each other as best they can. Others live in isolation, hermits in the deep desert, drawing what little life they need from the hardy plants that survive in the most remote places. They represent hope, faint and fragile, that magic does not have to mean destruction, that another path exists, even if it is nearly impossible to walk. The Veiled Alliance operates in several city-states, a secret organization of preservers and their allies working to undermine the Sorcerer King's power and spread the practice of preserving magic. They move in shadows, never revealing their full membership, communicating through codes and careful contacts. They sabotage the Templars' operations when they can. They rescue preservers marked for execution. They dream of a day when defiling is outlawed and the world can begin to heal. It is a dream that seems impossible given the power arrayed against them. But they persist because the alternative is to accept that Athas must continue dying until nothing remains. Beyond the city-states and between them, other communities struggle to survive. Elf tribes wander the deserts, traders and raiders who have adapted to life in constant motion. Dwarves focus on specific projects with legendary dedication, often mining operations or construction work that provides purpose in a harsh world. Halflings, descended from the ancient masters of the Blue Age, but having lost all knowledge of their heritage, live as feral cannibals in the few remaining forests. Thri-kreen insectoid mantis warriors hunt across the wastes in packs. Moles, half-dwarves bred specifically for slavery, combine dwarven endurance with human adaptability to create powerful laborers and gladiators. Each race that survived the Cleansing Wars did so through adaptation and sacrifice. The world does not support the populations it once did. Resources are scarce. Water is precious. Food requires constant struggle to obtain. Violence is endemic because with so little to go around, taking from others is often easier than producing for yourself. Trust is rare because betrayal can mean the difference between survival and death. The psychological weight of living in a dying world shapes every aspect of Athasian culture. There is a hardness to the people here, a pragmatism born of necessity. Compassion is often seen as weakness because helping others might mean you lack the resources to help yourself. Hope is dangerous because hope implies things can improve, and that belief can lead to crushing disappointment. Better to accept the reality of the harsh world and focus on surviving one more day, one more week, one more season. Yet somehow, people continue. They have children despite knowing those children will inherit an even harsher world. They build relationships, form communities, create art and music and stories. They laugh when they find reason to laugh. They love when they find someone to love. The capacity to adapt, to find meaning even in terrible circumstances, manifests on Athas in ways both inspiring and heartbreaking. The ruins scattered across the desert stand as monuments to what was lost. Cities that once housed hundreds of thousands are now empty stone skeletons, their populations dead or fled, their purpose forgotten. Roads that connected great civilizations lead nowhere, buried under sand or broken by the shifting earth. Temples to gods who are no longer worshipped crumble slowly under the assault of wind and time. These ruins are dangerous places, haunted by undead or claimed by monsters, or hiding traps left by ancient builders. But they also contain treasures, artifacts from the Green Age, knowledge that has been lost to the living world. Adventurers, desperate or greedy, or simply curious, venture into these ruins despite the risks. The pristine tower still stands where it has stood since the rebirth, ancient beyond reckoning. Its purpose still not fully understood. It draws certain individuals to it, calling to those with the potential for great power or great destruction. the tower can still transform, still alter the fundamental nature of living things. Some seek it hoping to gain power. Others study it trying to understand the magic that reshaped the world. A very few wonder if it could be used to undo some of the damage the cleansing wars inflicted, to restore life to the dying world. But the knowledge required to use the tower safely has been largely lost, and experiments with its power are as likely to create new catastrophes as to solve old ones. Deep beneath the world, in places hidden from the sun's merciless gaze, some fragments of the Green Age endure. Underground seas, isolated from the surface, still hold water and support ecosystems that remember what Athas once was. Cavern systems with their own water cycles maintain strange plant growth. These places are rare, fiercely protected by those who know of them, and vital beyond measure. They represent evidence that life can persist, that total devastation is not inevitable, that some pieces of the old world can be preserved. But better times seem farther away with each passing year. The Sorcerer-Kings continue their slow transformation toward full dragon status, and that transformation requires ever more defiling magic. Boris the dragon demands his annual levy to fuel Rajaat's prison, and that levy drains resources from city-states that can barely support their populations as it is. The climate continues to deteriorate as what little plant life remains is killed to fuel magic, and the water sources slowly evaporate. Some scholars observing these trends suggest that within a few centuries, Athas could become completely uninhabitable, a lifeless rock circling its crimson sun, the last survivors dying of thirst or starvation or simply heat. Others argue that a stable equilibrium will eventually be reached, that the devastation will plateau at some level that allows minimal life to persist indefinitely. The Sorcerer-Kings cannot defile everything they reason, because doing so would eliminate the source of their power. They will preserve enough plant life to sustain their magic, even if that means the vast majority of the world remains dead. It will be a terrible existence, survival at the absolute minimum, but it will be survival. A very few dreamers and rebels believe that restoration is possible. They point to the preservers and their magic that works with nature instead of against it. They study the ancient texts, looking for knowledge from the Green Age about agriculture and water management. They experiment with hardy plant species, trying to breed varieties that can survive in the degraded soil and harsh climate. And they wait for opportunities, for moments when the tyrant's attention is elsewhere, when real change might be possible. The history of the Cleansing Wars is known to scholars and carefully hidden from common people. The Sorcerer-Kings do not want their populations understanding the full scope of what was done to Athas. They present themselves as ancient rulers who have always governed their city-states, immortal beings who deserve obedience. The truth that they are genocidal champions who murdered entire species and destroyed the world in pursuit of power. This truth is suppressed viciously. Anyone who speaks too openly about the real history of the Cleansing Wars tends to disappear. But the truth persists in fragments and whispers. The ruins are evidence that cannot be completely suppressed. The environmental devastation speaks for itself, and there are always those who ask questions, who study the contradictions and anomalies, who piece together what really happened. These truth seekers often become preservers or join the Veiled Alliance, because understanding the history of the Cleansing Wars makes clear that the current system cannot be allowed to continue. You carry this history with you now. You understand how magic drank the seas dry. You know how the champions waged genocide and betrayed their master. You have witnessed the transformation of paradise into a world of ash and bone. This knowledge is a burden. It reveals the true cost of power pursued without restraint, of ambition untempered by conscience, of magic wielded without consideration for consequences. Athas stands as a warning. It demonstrates what happens when power is valued above life, when individuals prioritize their own advancement over the survival of their world. The Cleansing Wars could have been prevented at many points. Rajaat could have been stopped before he created defiling magic. The champions could have refused his mission. The wars could have been halted once the environmental devastation became apparent. But at each decision point, those with power chose personal gain over collective survival. And now everyone pays the price, not just those who made the choices, but generations born centuries after into a world that is dying because of decisions made long before they existed. The crimson sun rises each day over the desert, over the sea of silt, over the struggling city-states, and the desperate populations clinging to life in impossible conditions. It sets each night, and the darkness brings no relief, only cold instead of heat, and dangers different from those the day provides. And each day that passes is one more day that Athas dies a little more, that the circle of devastation spreads a little farther, that hope becomes a little harder to maintain. But still, somewhere, a preserver plants seeds in hidden soil. Somewhere, a rebel whispers truth to those who will listen. Somewhere, someone looks at the dying world and refuses to accept that this is how it must end. These acts of defiance are small, almost meaningless against the weight of history and the power of the Sorcerer-Kings. But they are not nothing. They are the possibility, fragile and unlikely, but real, that Athas might yet find a different path. The Cleansing Wars transformed a world. The betrayal of Rajaat changed history. And the choices made by everyone living on Athas today, from the mightiest Sorcerer King to the lowliest slave, these choices determine whether the dying continues until nothing remains, or whether some fragment of hope can grow into something more. You have walked through this history from the Blue Age to the present day. You have witnessed paradise lost, genocide enacted, betrayal and transformation. You understand now how magic drank the seas dry, how the cleansing wars turned a world to desert, and you carry this understanding forward, knowing that the story of Athas is not yet finished, that its final chapter remains unwritten. If you have found value in this journey through the deepest and darkest lore of the dark sun setting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are more stories to tell, more histories to uncover, more worlds to explore. Thank you for walking this path with me through the dying world of Athas.